Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for joining the Egyptian Vulture online conference. My name is Stefan Oppel. I'm a scientist with the RSVB, and I've been supporting the Egyptian Vulture New Life project with scientific advice and evidence. And we have a fantastic session now for the next hour and a half with a very interesting lineup of speakers that will tell us more about the evidence that we collected during the project and similar avenues, telling us more about survival of Egyptian vultures and which management actions have been successful. So enjoy the talks, and please remember that when you have questions for the speakers, you can go to the live Q&A tab and just enter all the questions as they pop into your head going through the talks. Always precede them with the name of the speaker so we know whom we should address the question to. And after the end of all the presentations, we should have 10 to 15 minutes with most of the speakers present to then answer any questions live on stage. So enjoy the session, and we'll see you in an hour and a half after the presentations for the question and answer session.
Hi, my name is Evan Buechley, and I'll present today on our highly collaborative paper published in 2020 entitled Differential Survival Throughout the Full Annual Cycle of a Migratory Bird Presents a Life History Trade-off. This research was a highly collaborative effort with 38 co-authors, many of whom I expect are in attendance at this conference. I would like to deeply thank all people, including all of the authors, as well as the numerous other people and organizations that contributed to Egyptian vulture conservation and research projects across 3 continents that made this collaboration possible. In this same collaborative spirit, Stefan Oppel, Ron Efrat, and myself co-led this research with roughly equal contributions to this paper. The fundamental question we are pursuing in this research is to better understand how migration evolved and how it is maintained in natural populations. Migrating across oceans and deserts is costly in terms of energy and potentially survival, but wintering in freezing conditions at northern latitudes could also be costly. Additionally, staying in the tropics and breeding there could come with high costs of competition, predation, parasitism, disease, etc. In theory, for migration to evolve, the cost of migration must be offset by the benefits of migrating. However, quantitatively evaluating the cost-benefit trade-off of migration in long-distance migrants has been extremely challenging to study because it is hard to know when and where migrants die. GPS tracking is increasingly revealing the movements and fates of migratory birds, thus enabling more in-depth study. This line of research is also relevant for better understanding why migratory bird populations are declining. In this collaborative study, we gathered GPS tracking data from Egyptian vultures across Europe, parts of the Middle East, and Africa. Birds were tagged with GPS transmitters that weighed between 16 and 48 grams, and they were attached with either backpack or leg loop harnesses. There's variation in duty cycles, and we resampled this data to 1 point per day per individual. Data sharing was facilitated by movebank.org, and all data processing was completed in R. After cleaning the data, we then delineated migration from stationary periods, and then we classified all of the fates of every individual as either alive, likely dead, confirmed dead, transmitter failure, or unknown. We estimated monthly survival probability of tracked birds using a multi-event capture-recapture model. We used a Bayesian framework for inference and parameter estimation. We assumed 3 true states: that a bird was either alive with a functioning tag, alive without a functioning tag, aka a transmitter failure, or dead. We modeled monthly survival between 2 main categories: whether an individual was migrating or stationary, and whether it was roughly on the breeding or wintering grounds. For the latter, we used a distinction of 25 degrees north, which is the center of the Sahara and Arabian deserts, as the geographic distinction between breeding and wintering grounds. We also accounted for population, separating between Western and Eastern European breeding populations, the age of the individual, whether it was wild or of captive origin, and included a random effect of year. This animation shows the movements of all tracked individuals included in the study. Yellow points indicate mortalities, green points indicate transmitter failures, and blue points unknown fates. Tagged individuals ranged over nearly 7,000 longitudinal kilometers from Western Africa to the Arabian Peninsula, and over 4,500 latitudinal kilometers from Europe to sub-Saharan Africa, covering approximately 70% of the species' current global distribution. Of the 220 birds, 173 were from Eastern breeding subpopulations, and 47 were from breeding subpopulations in Western Europe. Individuals were tracked for a median of 6 months with a range of 1 to 98 months, and a total of over 3,000 bird months, including 469 migrations. Final fate classifications at the end of the study period included 72 individuals alive, 52 confirmed dead, 38 likely dead, 8 confirmed transmitter failures, and 50 unknowns. There were proportionally more likely and confirmed mortalities from the eastern as compared to western subpopulations, more mortalities for juveniles, and more mortalities during fall migration than any other annual stage, despite individuals spending less time on migration than on breeding or non-breeding grounds. Likely and confirmed mortalities were primarily concentrated in the northeastern part of the study region, particularly the eastern Mediterranean basin. We recorded few mortalities in the Sahara Desert, despite many birds crossing the desert twice per year. In all, 17 individuals had their last positions terminate over the Mediterranean Sea and thus likely drowned. Additionally, 9 individuals were confirmed to have died from electrocution or collision with energy infrastructure. 7 were persecuted by humans, 6 died of natural causes, 6 were poisoned, 2 died from train collision, and for the remaining 43 individuals, the causes of death were unknown. Overall, over half of mortalities with a known cause were anthropogenic. It's important to note that when corrected for the time birds spent in different geographical regions, the number of unknown fates per tracking year was similar across regions, while the number of confirmed deaths was proportionally greater further north. This figure shows the predicted median monthly survival probability with 95% credible intervals. Overall, we identified lower survival during migration, higher survival south of the Sahara on wintering grounds, and that survival increased with age. This table shows the extrapolated annual survival probability for juvenile and adult Egyptian vultures from the eastern and western subpopulations. Monthly survival was higher for Egyptian vultures from Western Europe and increased with age. Birds of captive bred origin tended to have marginally lower survival, but the uncertainty in this effect was larger than the effect size. In summary, we revealed broad patterns in survival across most of the range of the Egyptian vulture. Survival was lower during migration as compared to stationary periods, and higher on non-breeding grounds in sub-Saharan Africa as compared to breeding grounds. This result indicates that there's a direct survival cost associated with long-distance migration, but that this lower survival during migration could be offset by the higher survival at southern non-breeding grounds. This doesn't answer the question of why Egyptian vultures leave the tropics to breed. The hypothesis would be that they have higher breeding productivity further north, but this requires further research to confirm. The higher survival at southern non-breeding grounds is not only of ecological and evolutionary relevance, but also has implications for the conservation of migratory species. The population declines of many long-distance migratory birds are often presumed to be a consequence of deteriorating conditions in the non-breeding areas, but we found that proportionally more mortalities occurred further north. We also found that approximately half of the mortalities for which a cause could be inferred were related to human activities or infrastructure. This suggests that the delicate trade-off that currently exists between the costs and benefits of migration could be easily disrupted by an increasing level of human-caused mortality anywhere along the migratory flyway. Apologies for this huge block of text, but I present it to show the number of people and partners, scientists, conservationists that contributed to this paper. Unfortunately, there's too many to mention in this short presentation, but I encourage you to look more at the paper to follow up on any details and also to see the list of collaborators therein. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention and feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions.
Hello everyone, I'm Volen Arkumarev from the Bulgarian Society for the Protection of Birds, and in the next couple of slides I'll briefly present you the restocking efforts for the Egyptian vulture in the Balkans. The Egyptian vulture has attracted people's attention from the early ages, and in most countries it occurs there are local legends and stories. It's a symbol of the spring, purity and wisdom. Despite that, the species is among the most threatened raptors. It has become extinct in most Balkan countries, and it is estimated that only around 50 pairs survive today in Bulgaria, Greece, North Macedonia and Albania, mostly in small and relatively isolated clusters. Its population in these countries is in collapse and has declined by 80% over the past 30 years, and there is almost 50% probability of extinction in the next 20 years. We implement a conservation strategy to save the species with two main pillars: reduce the mortality along the flyway and supplement the population by releasing captive bred individuals. An integrated population model we developed suggests that a 4% improvement in the survival of the wild individuals, combined with the release of 9 birds per year for 20 years or 6 birds per year for 30 years, would lead to a stable population while releases continue. However, a 6% improvement in the survival of the wild birds must be achieved to guarantee that the population will continue to increase when the releases stop. Feasibility study was prepared and trial releases of Egyptian vultures started in Bulgaria in 2016, but the efforts were intensified in the period 2018-2021 under the Egyptian Vulture New Life project. The releases were mostly done in the eastern Rhodops, which is in the core of the Balkan population. All released birds were tagged with GPS transmitters to follow their movements and record mortality. The captive bred individuals were provided by the Egyptian Vulture EEP within EASA with the kind support of Anton Vaidel from the Prague Zoo. The Egyptian vultures were released through 3 methods: hacking, fostering and delayed release. The aim was to evaluate the success of the methods and to identify the best release technique, which will be applied at a larger scale in the frame of the Egyptian Vulture Reinforcement Program. Hacking is a method that foresees releases of captive bred birds at age of fledgling from a hack, which is specially designed and installed at a cliff. In our case, it is abandoned nest of the species. The juveniles spend 2-3 weeks in the hack, adapting to the local conditions. When they reach the age of fledging in August, the entrance of the hack is open so that vultures can fledge whenever they want. They have about 3-4 weeks to adapt before the onset of the autumn migration. In the period 2016-2020, we released in total 9 Egyptian vultures through this method. However, the survival until the end of the first migration was only 22%. Overall, 43% of the mortalities were due to drowning into the Mediterranean Sea when the birds tried to cross between Greece and Africa. 1 bird was found exhausted in Turkey during migration, 1 was imprinted and recaptured, and the mortality cause for 1 individual remained unknown. The fostering represents a technique where captive bred birds are introduced in a wild foster nest of the species. For foster parents, we chosen only experienced pairs which are raising one chick at similar age. Once they have been accepted and raised by the foster parents, the captive bred birds will leave the nest together with the wild siblings. For the captive bred individuals, the fostering provides the chance to imprint to the behavior of the wild parents. We released 4 juveniles through this method in a period of 3 years. The survival until the end of the first migration is 50%. 2 birds died. One drowned into the Mediterranean Sea and another one died in Ethiopia, most probably due to predation. Delayed release foresees releases of captive bred Egyptian vultures in spring, when they are in their 2nd or 3rd calendar year. We hypothesize that when the birds are released in spring, they will have enough time before the autumn migration to gain experience, improve their physical fitness, socialize with other non-breeding vultures, gain knowledge for important feeding and roosting sites. So they spent about 2 months of adaptation in an aviary that is located at a vulture feeding station, and they are released in the second half of May when other immature birds are already present in the area. Then they have 4 months to live in the wild before the start of the south migration. We released 13 Egyptian vultures through this method in the period 2018-2021. All of them started migration, however, they usually started to migrate 2-3 weeks later than the wild birds. We recorded 69% survival until the end of the first migration. The main difference from the other methods was that these individuals had lower mortality in the Mediterranean Sea. The individuals released through this method either avoided sea crossings or managed to cross successfully the sea, waiting for perfect tailwinds to complete the long flight. Only one individual drowned, 2 were predated soon after the release, and 1 was electrocuted, while the reason for mortality of another one remains unknown. On this animation, you can see the movements of 2 Egyptian vultures released through delayed release. Over a period of 4 years, they traveled over 20 countries in the Balkans, Middle East and Africa until they returned to the release site. We compared the survival in the first 6 months between the individuals released through the 3 methods and wild juveniles used as controls. This period covers the post-release adaptation and the first south migration. For this comparison, only wild juvenile Egyptian vultures tagged in Bulgaria and northern Greece were considered. The survival of the wild juveniles was 59%. The captive bred individuals released through fostering had survival of 50%. The survival of the delayed released individuals was the highest, 69%, while the individuals released through hacking had the lowest survival rates, 22%. The delayed released individuals needed on average 2 times longer time to complete their first fall migration than the wild juveniles. In 2022, 7 of the released Egyptian vultures returned to Bulgaria. 6 released birds through delayed release and 1 released through hacking. 2 individuals formed pairs with wild partners and occupied breeding territories for the first time. One of these individuals is Buyana, that has visited 22 countries in 3 continents until she returned to breed back in Bulgaria, and you can see her wanderings on the map below. Unfortunately, Buyana was shot by poachers in her breeding territory just before the start of the autumn migration in 2022. Another female, Izzy, paired with a wild GPS-tagged subadult individual named Lucky. They occupy the breeding territory in the Eastern Rhodops as well, and you can see their synchronous flights on the other map. Overall, the population of the Egyptian vulture in Bulgaria is stable over the past 5 years, with about 26 breeding pairs. Based on the results of the trial releases, we developed a reinforcement strategy for the species in Bulgaria and Greece with a scope of 20 years. The strategy provides detailed steps and framework for the implementation of the program. It will be regularly updated at 5 years intervals, integrating the latest knowledge and experience from its implementation. However, so far, the captive breeding within EEP cannot provide the required 6-9 chicks per year. Therefore, the size of the captive breeding pool needs to be increased over the next years. Additional efforts are also needed to improve the breeding success of the species in captivity, which currently is very low. In Bulgaria, wild juveniles may be collected from their nests under a certain predefined criteria, like hatch too late, lost a parent, suffer a disease or other, and these individuals will be raised in a breeding center and released through delayed release to increase their survival. In 2022, 4 such individuals were already released in Bulgaria.
Thank you for the attention.
Hello everybody, my name is Vladimir Dobrev and I'm Conservation Officer in the Egyptian Vulture New Life project, and here with my colleague Emil Yordanov we're gonna present the first documented case of cainism in the Egyptian Vulture. Brood reduction, where sibling aggression is responsible for the loss of the second chick, is a widespread phenomenon among raptor species. This phenomenon is called cainism, and it can be either obligate or facultative, but the outcome is always the same. Two main hypotheses exist that try to explain the obligate sibling killing. The first one is the assurance that the second egg is a substitute if something happens to the first one, and in the second hypothesis, obligate suicide might be a consequence of an evolutionary process favoring the raising of high-quality offspring. Despite this phenomena is spread among many raptor species, such as some large eagles, and also in vulture species like the bearded vulture, a pivotal knowledge is absent for some of them, and for others there is no data that exists at all. Similar is the case with the Egyptian vulture. To detect similar events in endangered species like the Egyptian vulture, sophisticated monitoring methods are required. That's why in the last 12 years we have intensively been using different kind of video and trail cameras for several main reasons. First of all, to keep track on individuals and account for replacement rate in pairs of Egyptian vultures, but also to account for mortality that might occur in juveniles or adult birds. Another reason to use these devices is to study closely the breeding biology and ecology of the species, which eventually can address important conservation measures. And last but not least, the use of live cameras and trail cameras might help registration of rare and or non-described so far events. Using live streaming camera installed in an Egyptian vulture nest helped us to detect the first case of cainism in the Egyptian vulture. The case was detected in a wild nest of the species in 2018 when the pair laid 2 eggs that were hatched in the end of May, and then the second egg was hatched 6 days later on the 1st of June, with a difference of 6 days between the younger and the older chick. However, the aggression between the chicks was not unlocked until the younger chick became 9 days old, when instantly the older one started showing higher level of aggression towards the younger sibling, pecking the younger chick aggressively, regardless if the food was provided by the adult birds or not. This pair is supplementary fed, so food provisioning and food were no limitation for the chicks, and eventually this was not the reason that could have unlocked the aggression between the chicks. This aggression lasted for 3 days straight, and in all the time the older chick was aggressively pecking the younger one and preventing it from reaching the food that was provided by the parents. And eventually the younger chick was growing weaker and weaker every next day, and on 12 days age the younger chick died because of, it, of its wounds, and later on was eaten by the parent. It's worth noticing that both adults were very active and they were trying to split both chicks all the time during the 3 days of aggression between the younger and the older chick, but never succeeded doing so. Considering the long period of time that we have been observing Egyptian vulture nests with live and trail cameras, and that this case of cainism was observed only in 2018, we might probably conclude that this event is very rare in the Egyptian vulture, and application of alternative methods for monitoring, such as the usage of different kind of trail and live cameras, could help in the future for the detection of more of similar cases. Thanks for your attention.
Good morning. I am Guido Ceccolini, President of the SEM Association. I thank for the invitation. Since my English is bad, my wife Anna will give the presentation. Ciao, good listening.
Good morning. The CERM Association runs the Egyptian Vulture project, aiming at implementing practical conservation measures in the attempt of preventing the extinction of the species in Italy. The main activities which are carried out are the following: the management of an Egyptian vulture captive breeding program at the CERM Endangered Raptor Center, created in 1993 and located in Tuscany. The center is hosting 42 Egyptian vultures. The development of captive breeding techniques. 74 individuals were born between 1997 and 2022. And the release into the wild of captive-born fledgling juveniles. Since 2018, the activities carried out in the framework of the Life Egyptian Vulture project. In total, 48 individuals were released between 2003 and 2022. The management of supplementary feeding points in sensitive areas. Between 2004 and 2015, the CERM Association released in a rocky ravine in the Gravina of La Terza, Apulia region, through the hacking method, 14 fledglings born at the CERM or in other European centers. Before the release, the birds spent 4 or 5 adaptation days inside a natural cave, close by a net or inside an egg box, directly overlooking the canyon. Between 2018 and 2021, 19 more Egyptian vultures, captive born at the CERM, were released in the framework of the Life Egyptian Vulture project in a semi-flat area inside a feeding site for raptors in the Murgia Materana Natural Park in Basilicata region. For the adaptation phase, a video monitor egg box was used. It was noted that nearly all young Egyptian vultures released in the Murgia Materana Natural Park chose power poles of medium voltage located in the release area as diurnal or nocturnal roosts. They rarely used the rock faces about 1 kilometer far away. This habit, which was thought to be temporary, turned out to be permanent for almost all released individuals. The power lines surrounding the release area are safe for birds, and this guaranteed their safety as long as they started to make medium or large scale movements. GPS monitoring showed that the Egyptian vultures have continued to perch on power poles or pylons of power lines during their wanderings, during migration and wintering in Africa, even in the presence of close rocky gorges. Some individuals have been observed at sunset, leaving the rocky phases where they were perched on to move for perching and rest on the poles of the closest power line. Of course, this behavior has been adverse implications. 3 of the individuals which were released through this method died electrocuted, and the others ran the same risk. On the contrary, the young Egyptian vultures released between 2004 and 2015 in the Gravina of La Terza Canyon have always been observed perching on rocky faces or trees, and they have never been tracked on the power poles in the area. Furthermore, checking the position data, it has been seen that during the migration, these Egyptian vultures rested or spent the night on natural or artificial rock walls, quarries, and trees. We have no knowledge of any Egyptian vulture released in the Gravina of La Terza Canyon dead due to electrocution. For example, it doesn't seem that Sarah, an individual born in captivity and released in 2015, whose GPS is still working in 2022, has ever used power poles as diurnal or nocturnal roosts. It appears that we are dealing with an environmental imprinting of the released Egyptian vultures, previously unknown, which occurs just after the release and strongly influences the long-term selection of their diurnal and nocturnal roosting habitats. So there is the need to perform the releases into the wild in a natural setting similar to that of the species nesting, that is, canyons. On the basis of these first findings, in 2022, 6 juveniles were released in a new site which overlooks rocky faces. None of them during the acclimatization phase, and their movements have so far used poles to rest. They normally perch on rocky faces or trees. A detailed analysis of the available GPS data is in progress in cooperation with ISPRA, based on relevant sample of roosts used by the released Egyptian vultures. These initial findings aim at suggesting to anyone committed in release programs of captive-born individuals to carefully select the release sites, avoiding to install adaptation aviaries or boxes far from rock walls, especially if there are power lines nearby. That even if power lines in the release sites are insulated for preventing birds' electrocution, given that the vast majority of power lines elsewhere, both in Europe and Africa, is not insulated. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hello to everybody. The Egyptian vulture is one of the most endangered birds in Italy, with a small population estimated in only 11-14 pairs, distributed in 2 main areas, Sicily and the southernmost part of the peninsula. Despite the very small number of individuals, the overall population has remained stable since 2000. We tried to assess the viability of the small population occurring in southern Italy by estimating the number of non-breeding individuals as a proxy of the recruitment in the following years. Our estimates of non-breeding individuals was based on two distinct methods. First, we considered the number of fledged wild juveniles and the number of captive bred individuals released in previous years after deducting the mortality. Secondly, we examined the sightings of non-breeding individuals recorded in the last breeding season. Our study area corresponds to the breeding area in the southern part of the Italian peninsula. Here, we conducted intensive surveys between 2017 and 2021 to find breeding pairs and to assess the number of fledglings in each nest. In 2022, we collected sightings of juveniles and subadults and adults outside occupied territories. Overall, we monitored 14 breeding attempts with 24 fledged birds. The breeding success was really very high. In the study period, 20 captive bred individuals of different age were released, 19 of them in the framework of the Life Egyptian Vulture project. To assess how many birds born in the wild or released in the past years could be still alive in 2022, we applied the annual survival probability calculated by Buechley and colleagues. Overall, we can expect that 19 birds are still alive in 2022, 10 of which in Europe and 9 in Africa, where we considered remain the birds aged 2 or 3 years. This estimate was confirmed by the sightings of individuals during the last breeding season. Based on photos and dates, in the study area, we estimated at least 7 adults and 2-3 immature birds. In conclusion, we observed that the number of expected individuals matches the number of observed birds in 2022. We found that the number of adults subadults is high if compared to the number of breeding pairs. So the current population level seems to be assured in the short term by recruitment. Restocking concurs to increase the number of non-breeding birds in a substantial way, but to assure the conservation of the population in the long term, urgent measures to reduce mortality are needed. Thank you very much for your attention.
Of birds, BirdLife Bulgaria, and will shortly present you the work of NCE, BirdLife Egypt, and BSPB and RSPB on monitoring Egyptian vulture spring migration at Galala in Egypt. Monitoring raptors along migration corridors can be used to assess changes in population size. Along the eastern Mediterranean flyway, several migratory bottlenecks exist, where a large number of migratory soaring birds congregate during migration. Many large soaring birds avoid crossing the Red Sea during migration and take 2 alternative routes in autumn. One of them along the Arabian coast of the Red Sea, and then entering into Africa through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait between Yemen and Djibouti. Another part of the migrants take another flyway over Suez and then heading south through the Sahara Desert. However, due to the harsh weather conditions at Bab el-Mandeb, the birds spending the winter in Africa do not cross the strait back on their spring migration. Therefore, they follow the African coast during the spring. On the maps, you see the tracking data from Egyptian vultures tagged with GPS transmitters in the Balkans, Turkey, and Caucasus, which clearly show that pattern. Using the tracking data of 80 Egyptian vultures, we counted the number of migratory journeys of the tagged birds per 20-kilometer cells in order to identify the hotspots of spring migration as shown on the map. Based on this data, we established a new observatory at the well-known spring migration bottleneck along the northern Red Sea coast near the Galala city. Birds that winter across a large area of sub-Saharan Africa migrate northeast until they meet the Red Sea and then follow the western Red Sea coastline to Suez, flying just over Galala. In March 2022, we conducted exploratory work around the new city of Galala to identify monitoring locations that could capture the majority of migratory soaring birds passing through this region. We first physically explored a range of potential observation sites and then counted migratory soaring birds from 3 observation stations that could comprise the new Galala Bird Observatory network. We collected data on migrating birds between the 1st of March and the 20th of April 2022, with daily observations occurring between 8 in the morning and 6 in the afternoon local time, except on days when the migration intensity was low or logistical difficulties prevented monitoring activities for certain parts of the day. All data was recorded with the TrackTalent app. For the Egyptian vultures, we recorded the age class of all clearly visible individuals. What we observed in Galala was spectacular. We recorded over 350,000 migratory birds from 28 species, and thus almost twice as many birds as a previous study done in 2012. Since we count from the top of the mountain, in most occasions birds fly just overhead or even below the mountain ridge, which makes the experience extraordinary. The Galala Bird Observatory is ideally placed to record a significant proportion of the global populations of the lesser spotted eagle, the steppe eagle, the steppe buzzard, and the Egyptian vulture. We recorded the largest number of Egyptian vultures at any migration point on the eastern Mediterranean flyway, with over 1,200 individuals. The peak of the Egyptian vulture migration was in the last week of March and the first week of April. In the beginning of the counting period, we recorded mostly adults, while in April the number of immatures and subadults gradually increased. It is important to highlight that our main goal was to monitor the Egyptian vulture migration. The different raptor species may need different survey periods to achieve the best results. The data gathered can be used to examine many questions related to bird migration like timing, weather variations, and species composition, and provides opportunities for collaboration with local and international universities. NCU will continue its immense work to make Galala Bird Observatory a famous spot for spring migration and establish long-term monitoring scheme. The regular monitoring may be used to inform the success of the various conservation actions on target species such as the Egyptian vulture along the entire flyway, but also to inform future development proposals which might pose risk to the migratory birds in the area. Thank you for your attention.
Hi, my name is Evan Buechley, and I will present today on our highly collaborative paper published in 2019 entitled Spatial and Temporal Variability in Migration of a Soaring Raptor Across 3 Continents. I would also like to acknowledge Pascual Lopez for creating this presentation, which I'll present today. As I mentioned, this research was a highly collaborative effort with 40 co-authors, many of whom I expect are in attendance at this conference. I would like to deeply thank all people, including all of the authors, as well as the numerous other people and organizations that contributed to Egyptian vulture conservation and research projects across 3 continents that made this collaboration possible. In the same collaborative spirit, Louis Phipps, Pascual Lopez, Stefanopoulos, and myself also co-led this research with roughly equal contributions to this paper. Migratory bird populations are in decline globally, and they provide important ecological functions and ecosystem services. Threats to migratory birds at any specific location can impact populations across continents. Migration is usually analyzed at the individual, local, or population level, but with this large collaborative effort, we had an opportunity to study migration across a significant portion of a species range. Accordingly, we set out to analyze spatial and temporal variability of migratory movements within and among individuals and subpopulations. By better understanding factors that influence migrations, we may be better prepared to understand causes of decline and/or to predict how a species may respond to environmental change. We included data covering approximately 70% of the species distribution, as shown here. More specifically, the dataset included tracking data from 2007 to 2018. This included 94 individuals. We classified these into 4 discrete breeding populations: Western Europe, the Balkans, Middle East, and the Caucasus. Western Europe included birds summering in Portugal, Spain, and southern France. The Balkans included birds summering in Albania, Bulgaria, Greece, and North Macedonia. Middle East included birds summering in Israel, and Caucasus included birds summering in northeastern Turkey, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, northwestern Iran, and the Dagestan province of Russia. We classified the data by the age of the bird, with juveniles classified as first calendar year birds, immatures as second to fifth calendar year, and adults as older than fifth calendar year. Egyptian vultures were trapped and tagged with GPS transmitters weighing between 24 and 45 grams. Transmitters were attached with either backpack or leg loop harnesses. Transmission rates varied for the transmitters, but we resampled all the data to similar intervals for all individuals, approximately 1 point per hour. We only included data from complete migration tracks for the comparisons, and all data manipulations and analyses were completed in R, while data storage and sharing was facilitated by movebank.org. One of the first steps of the analysis was to determine start and end dates of spring and fall migration, as compared to breeding and non-breeding periods. To do so, we used net squared displacement of individuals over time. This enables visualization and analysis of how far an individual traveled from a starting point, such as a nest or a location of tagging. In the plot shown here, gray points, which are rather obscured by the blue line, are plots of the net squared displacement of individuals from their tagging location over time. While in their summer range, net squared displacement remains approximately constant around 0, followed by a steep increase during fall migration, then a plateau as the individual reaches the winter range, followed by a steep downward slope during spring migration. We identified the point at which an individual first initiated a fall migration as the first point at which NSD, or net squared displacement, continuously increased away from the summer range, and the end of migration is the first point at which net squared displacement values plateaued upon reaching the winter range, and vice versa for spring migration. We use the migrate-R package in R to quantitatively classify migration as compared to other movement models, such as dispersal, residency, or nomadism. After cleaning the data and identifying complete migrations, we were left with a dataset that had 188 complete migrations, including 71 spring migrations and 117 fall migrations, which are shown in this figure, the fall being the orange and the spring migrations in green. This included migrations by 60 individual Egyptian vultures. Of the completed migrations, 24 were completed by juveniles, 36 by immatures, and 128 by adults. Migration routes entered 44 different countries, with the Balkan subpopulation passing through the most with 28 countries, followed by the Caucasus with 20 countries, Western Europe with 12, and the Middle East 6 countries. We found that the distance between summer and winter grounds was much greater for Eastern subpopulations as compared to Western Europe. That the Balkan subpopulation traveled significantly longer distances on migrations. That adults migrated faster in autumn than in spring. and that the routes of migrations for vultures that summer in the Balkans were much less straight. We found that the duration of migration decreased with age. This could be caused by experience or selective pressures, with adults having incentives to arrive early on breeding grounds to occupy territories. Immature individuals from all subpopulations started spring migration later than adults, with the greatest difference observed in the Balkan subpopulation, where there is a difference between adult and immature median start date of migration of 53 days. There was high repeatability within subpopulations in the 3 route-related migration parameters, including cumulative travel distance, direct distance, and straightness. This confirmed that there was more variation in these parameters between than within each subpopulation. There was high correlation between summer and winter longitudes and high Mantel test scores across all individuals, indicating very high migratory connectivity at the species level. However, within each subpopulation, there was insignificant correlations and negative Mantel scores, indicating very low migratory connectivity within subpopulations. The Balkan subpopulation exhibited an average migration corridor with 3 to 4 times larger than the Western Europe and Caucasus subpopulation. For the Western Europe subpopulation, the fall migration corridor was approximately twice as wide as the spring migration corridor, whereas the opposite was observed for the Caucasus subpopulation, with the spring migration corridors being over 4 times larger than the fall migration corridor. In conclusion, a large collaboration among researchers allowed us to compile a large telemetry data set of including 94 individuals, 188 completed migration tracks, which covered approximately 70% of the species' global distribution. We showed that there's high migratory connectivity at large spatial scales or at the species level, but that there's very low migratory connectivity within individuals of a certain subpopulation. The basic migration parameters showed high level of variability at the subpopulation level and including flexibility at the individual level. Migratory duration was longer and there were faster migration speeds in the Balkans and Caucasus as compared to Western Europe. This may be related to ecological barriers, particularly large water bodies like the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. Migratory performance also increased with age, particularly adults in spring. And adult spring migrations to Western Europe and the Balkans were longer and slower than fall migrations, which is an interesting and somewhat unusual finding. And up to 44 different countries were visited by tracked individuals, which really shows the need for international collaboration for conservation. We have very many people to thank for this large collaborative analysis. Unfortunately, there's too many to go into depth in this presentation, but I would ask that you refer to the paper for detailed acknowledgements of everybody that was involved in collecting this data and analyzing it and funding this project. More information can be found by looking up this paper. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Jenny Weston and I work for the RSPB in the Global Species Recovery Team based in the UK. In 2016, the Flyway Action Plan for the Egyptian vulture was integrated into the Multi-Species Action Plan for African Eurasian vultures and formally adopted at COP12 in Manila in 2017. The plan covers 33 countries totaling more than 16 million square kilometres and has 59 actions covering key threats such as poisoning and energy infrastructure, as well as important actions on raising awareness and improving national legislation to protect the species. We have now reached the midpoint of this 10-year plan and look to review the implementation so far. I have been in touch with many of you in recent months as we have worked on this large task, and here I will explain the process and present some preliminary findings ahead of our workshop on Thursday. As well as reviewing implementation of all the actions, we have also collated information on new research, changes to key sites for the species, and changes in population trends. A lead contact for each country collated a response on behalf of NGOs, government departments, police, and other relevant individuals. We have followed the methods set out by BirdLife in 2001 to review action plan implementation, as has been used by other vulture species action plan reviews. In the original action plan, all actions were listed as essential, high, medium, or low priority, and we asked contributors to carry out this process again. Then the level of implementation was scored. If an action wasn't relevant in that country, a score of 0 means the action is no longer considered in the analysis. Using the method, we then combined these scores to give an action priority index, which gives a score between 0 and 4, where completed actions have a score of 0, and those which are high priority and have had little or no work done towards them score 4. Implementation of the actions has varied along the Flyway, ranging a score between 1 and 2.7. Average implementation is around 1.4. Countries which are starred here are part of the current Egyptian Vulture New Life project, but we should also consider other large-scale projects such as the Marva Foundation and Migratory Soaring Birds projects and the impact that they have on implementation. I will go through one expected result as an example of the data tables we have produced and are now considering. Expected result 1 concerns the effective surveillance, prevention, investigation and enforcement of anti-poison work carried out across all range states, and includes specific actions on central databases for poisoning data, the creation of specialist wildlife crime units, and monitoring the impact of NSAIDs, etc. On this table, the action priority index is displayed for each country. These were calculated using the original priority score for the whole Flyway, rather than the score given by each country in this exercise. Note the blank columns are because the action was not considered necessary in that region in the 2016 Flyway Action Plan. Values of 0 mean the action is fully implemented. Actions with an API score of 4 means the actions are high priority, but very little implementation has been carried out in the last 5 years. Therefore, certain actions and regions are likely where further work needs to be carried out in the remaining 5 years of this plan. All actions in the original framework for action were given a timescale. The ones highlighted here in red were given a short to medium timescale for addressing, which means they were to be tackled and complete within the first 5-year time period, which has now come to an end. The blank columns are because at the time of the Flyway Action Plan was written, these actions were not considered necessary in some regions. From some of the information returned by participants, however, it looks as though some of these issues need to be considered elsewhere on the Flyway, specifically including actions surrounding poisoning detection teams in the Middle East and the installation of electric infrastructure in Central Asia, for example. We have a workshop on Thursday where we will discuss the scoring and initial results and ensure that scoring is standardised across the Flyway, as well as looking to consider the priorities for the next 5 years. By the end of this month, we hope to have a first draft of the review, which will then have a public consultation period, and then the final report will be published by the end of the year, complete with recommendations. A really big thank you to everyone who has contributed information to the review so far. The key purpose is to use this information to enhance the conservation status of Egyptian vultures along the Flyway. The current Egyptian Vulture New Life project resulted exactly from the Egyptian Vulture Flyway Action Plan in 2016, and future large-scale international projects on Egyptian vulture conservation on this Flyway will likely be catalysed by this midterm review. Thank you.
Hello, back again. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. This is a fantastic session with very interesting talks about survival and migration of the species. That is fundamental to all the conservation work that we do. We have a few questions. Unfortunately, not all the speakers are here, so we'll try and go through the questions for the people who are here first, and then move on to the questions that we collectively can answer between Volen, Ron, and myself. So the first question comes from Rosa Savier and is to Vladi. Was there any food stress in the nest? So when you recorded the cainism of the 2 chicks, or were the chicks fed regularly in the days before the attack occurred?
Thanks for the question. No, there was no stress. The chicks were fed regularly, and this is one of our best pairs with great parents who are really taking very good care of the chicks. Both birds were actually trying to split and to separate the fighting chicks, but yeah, finally the younger one died.
Okay, thank you. And then we have a question from Richard Porter about the migration count data, and unfortunately Khaled is not here, but Volen, maybe you can answer that. So Richard is concerned that we may not get sufficient volunteers. So he's wondering whether we're confident that we get enough competent volunteers each year to ensure that Galala becomes a permanent count site to enable population monitoring. And the second question is whether there has actually been an analysis of migration count data that enabled population trends to be identified.
Yeah, regarding the volunteers and experienced people to count at Galala, it's definitely something difficult to guarantee in the long term. And it depends on many conditions, but unfortunately NC and nobody from NC is present here today, but what we can assure is that NC is very motivated to keep that count running and to build an observatory there. So they already have a property, they have some permissions for the place, and they have plans to build an observatory and attract as many people as possible every year to make it rolling. And actually, considering the potential of the site and the number of species and the number of individuals observed there, really there is a great potential to attract international volunteers to attend this event. And also, Galala is very close to Cairo, so there is an airport nearby. So the conditions are there, the motivation of the team is there, and we hope that it will turn into a long-term program in the future. Regarding the trends, probably Stefan can answer that question.
Yes, so I agree. I think Galala holds great promise, and Richard, the problem is that the sites on the Eastern Mediterranean that have been running for long enough, they do not count a large number of Egyptian vultures, and the sites that we've established in the last 5 to 10 years, specifically for Egyptian vultures, we do not have sufficient data yet. There is large interannual variability. There's also a lot of variability due to effort, especially during the COVID years. We lost 2 years. So we don't have reliable trend information, but I do think that is possible along the lines of what the people in Batumi do for many other species, but they don't see many Egyptian vultures at Batumi. So we just need to increase the effort and keep it constant for at least 10 years before we can actually say anything about trends. We have another question from Patrick Budarel to Pascual, who's not here, but Ron, maybe you can answer that question, given that you were involved in the paper that Evan presented about migration. The question is, how can we explain it that the spring migration is longer or slower than the fall migration for the Egyptian vultures? Because it looks contrary that most birds would be in a hurry to return in spring, and so the spring migration should be faster, and we seem to have found the opposite.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. I think that the spring migration is longer for non-breeding birds because they're just not in a hurry. The data you mentioned that most birds are in a hurry in spring is relevant for birds that are in a hurry to breed. But since Egyptian vultures only start breeding at a late age, means that they can take their time. I don't think anyone looked at it for Egyptian vultures yet, but sometimes in some routes, wind conditions are not as good in spring as in autumn, so that might also be a reason.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think the solar radiation is also different. So some birds, soaring migrants, can be slower in spring because the thermal conditions are just poorer than in late summer, when you have much more thermals, and it's easier for soaring birds to find thermals than to glide. So that might explain also slower speeds. We have a question from Violeta Barrios to Evan Buechley, who's also not here. Did you identify individuals that will stay and breed in Africa, and or southern individuals that will die in the northern part of the Flyway? And I think we can also collectively answer that. So in this analysis that Evan showed, where we analyzed the survival, we didn't look at whether birds stayed in Africa to breed. We don't have any evidence yet that the birds that we marked in the northern hemisphere remained in Africa to breed. So we have lots of immature birds that stay there for sometimes up to 4 or 5 years, but those that survive that long then generally return. But we do have some birds that we marked in Ethiopia during winter. So these were probably birds that always bred in the northern hemisphere that then migrated, and we had 1 or 2 that died in Turkey or were poisoned in Turkey. Yeah.
And one in Israel.
One in Israel. So
one in Saudi Arabia.
The birds that we capture in Africa are to a large part birds that migrate there during the winter, and there is a dearth of information about the resident populations of Egyptian vultures, something that Chloe mentioned yesterday also in her talk about the Egyptian vultures in Niger. Information about the breeding success, phenology, we lack that across a large part of the species range in Eastern Africa. Then I had another question to you, Ron, and that was concerning your explanation that the captive reared juveniles had kind of slower migratory performance. So they didn't migrate as far and as fast on a given day as wild birds. And you speculated that this might be related to them missing sort of the crucial flight training period, because they're in captivity at a certain age when wild birds would usually start flying around. And I'm wondering, is there any way that you can imagine how we can improve captive breeding of birds to facilitate the birds learning to fly as soon as possible by larger aviaries or something to avoid this missing that crucial period where the birds should be learning to fly?
It's a very good question. I'm not sure that I have an answer. I'm not sure that there is an answer because, as you could also see in my results, it's not just flying. It's not the ability to flap their wings or to soar. It's the ability to deal with different weather conditions. And what we show is that in strong tailwinds, for example, they don't fly as well as wild birds. And you can't reproduce these strong tailwinds in captivity. You can't build a big enough cage for that. So I think that they need to be in the wild in order to really learn it. I do need to say that the results that you saw in this presentation, since then I had some more data and some better analysis, and it seems that the difference during further migration, during second and third migration and on, is not as big as I showed in the presentation which I recorded 2 weeks ago. It's still an ongoing process. So maybe the more important question to ask is, how does it affect them in the future? Do we know if it really affects their breeding abilities or other things? Because we see survival isn't affected. So once we know if it really has further effects, we then need to ask, how do we deal with it?
Great, thank you. And the last question is also, I think it comes from having listened to the talks of Guido and Anna. And it seems that the survival of birds in Italy from hacking was much better than what we experienced in the Balkans. And I'm wondering, Volen or Ron, if you can speculate how you might explain those differences, that the delayed release in Italy didn't seem to be as successful as we have found in the Balkans, or why the hacking didn't go so well in the Balkans compared to Italy?
Yeah, regarding the delayed release, the results in Bulgaria and in Israel are very similar. Like we have higher survival of the captive birds than the wild ones due to the high mortality of wild chicks into the Mediterranean. So if we exclude that, then the captive and wild chicks have similar survival as Ron showed in his presentation. In comparison to Italy, maybe regarding the delayed release, the main difference probably is the period of release. Like as we heard from the presentation yesterday and today, in Italy they released the delayed release birds mostly in summer, and only this year they did some releases in spring, while we always release them in spring, and in Israel they release them even earlier in December, January. So the birds have really more time to adapt and start learning to fly and find food and everything. And regarding the hacking, what we found for the birds released through hacking in Bulgaria, comparing with the wild individuals, is that actually birds coming from the captive breeding centers, usually, at least from those centers that we took birds from, hatch later than the chicks in the wild. But once released, they started migration at the same time as the wild chicks. So they had even shorter period for adaptation before the start of the migration. That's why the hatching time, I think, for the hacking is very important. And from the zoos from in Vienna and Prague, from where we mostly took birds, they were just hatching later than in the wild. Maybe there is a difference in Italy because they breed at the same latitude as they are released. So maybe they breed at similar times as the wild pairs. Guido and Anna can share more about that, but I think this is a difference.
Okay. If I have time for just a few comments on the issue. Okay. Yes, it's true. We released most of the captive-born Egyptian vulture through the delayed release in summer, so in a different period in comparison with Bulgaria. And we only released 4 Egyptian vultures with a delayed release in spring. And another difference is that our birds spent a few days in the aviary or in the egg box, in the release site. So we probably in the next year we should try to increase this acclimatization phase in the release site. I don't know, but maybe there could also be with hacking a problem of fitness of the birds. So maybe birds born in one center can have can be more have a better fitness in comparison with other birds born in other stations. So it's not easy to make a comparison between these different birds of different origin. It's not easy. And furthermore, I agree with Volen that the hatching period is important. For example, usually we don't release birds born in June, for example, in middle June. We have sometimes pairs breeding late during the breeding season, and we don't release them in the year. So we wait for the next year and release them in their second or third calendar year. We don't release them with the hatching method because we have also a problem with hunting. If we release them too late, for example, in late August or in early September, in Italy, the hunting season starts. So we fear that they can that poaching can affect them more than birds released earlier in middle August, for example. And this is another important issue to be taken into account.
Great. Thank you very much. There was also Mike McGrady entered some information in the Q&A box that there's a study on golden eagle behavioral development that shows that some late released birds might miss the peak at which they acquire certain behaviors. Mike, if you could send that reference, that'd be very helpful. Thank you very much. So thank you all for participating in the research and monitoring session. It was great presentations. We are now heading for a short break of 15 minutes. So once this closes, please return to your timeline using the return to timeline button in the top left of your screen. And after the break in the 15 minutes, we go into breakout rooms. So please click on the bar for your chosen roundtable and follow the Zoom link that appears on the right of your screen, because the breakout sessions happen on Zoom and not in this main Events Air platform. Thank you very much for all the presenters, and we'll see you in the workshop roundtables.